Today, I've invited a very special guest to talk to us and tell us his perspective on the law. I have Aaron Jacobs, goes by AJ. AJ was a former D.P.S. police officer. He now has his own podcast, and I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit about his podcast. Very interesting life and life change.
Yes.
So AJ, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
So a little bit about myself. I'm a military veteran. I spent 4 years in the military. After that, I got out and became a police officer here in the state of Arizona for the Arizona State Troopers. I did 11 years with them, 9 years in patrol, 3 years on SWAT as a crisis negotiator, and then 2 of those years I spent as a detective with the Special Investigations Unit. Unfortunately, what happened in my life, and I'm open to talk about it, is the fact that I was overcome with all the stuff that police officers are overcome with regarding dealing with bad situations and PTSD and all that stuff. Made some poor decisions in my personal life, which led to my untimely demise and life in law enforcement. After I left law enforcement, I went back to school, went back to college, got my degree, graduated from NAU. During that time, just working being a stay-at-home dad. But then I also, during my last year in law enforcement, I actually suffered a pretty serious back injury, 2 herniated discs, sciatica, and all that stuff. So that led me down the path of doctors and rehab and all that type of stuff. And then in November of 2017, my back exploded and I was physically incapacitated. Very, very long story short, I had surgery, I re-herniated, dealing with pain throughout this entire time, which led me to being prescribed opiates, which are the worst thing on the planet. During that period of time, I needed something that was going to allow me to function as a human being, so I looked into medicinal cannabis. And so this is after law enforcement, been gone out of it for a while. I got into and started using medicinal cannabis. To be totally honest, I have a brother who's been for lack of a better term, a pothead for 25 years. And during this period of time, I was like, I need something. He brought me a little something. I tried it and I had miraculous results. And from that, after the surgery had failed and I needed something for my everyday pain management, as opposed to taking opioids every 4 hours and ruining your life going down that path and addiction and all that stuff, I switched over to medicinal cannabis. Got into the medicinal cannabis world. Because of my background, I was invited to join the board of NORML, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, the Arizona chapter. So I'm a board member now for Arizona NORML, which has led me down the path of being an advocate for patients and consumers of cannabis, both now on the recreational side, but mostly on the medicinal side, and working with lawmakers and senators and all that to get good marijuana laws on the books and to keep the medical marijuana program, functioning at a level that people can use it, keeping the recreational side functioning at a level where people can enjoy it, and just working with lawmakers and all that. I do host and run my own podcast called the Blue to Green podcast, blue, law enforcement, green. I used to wear a tan uniform, but nobody would understand the reference from tan to green, so I just stuck with blue. But my entire point of my podcast is to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the cannabis community and to educate everybody. No, I don't have a degree in biology or anything like that, but I've done a ton of research and I work with doctors now regarding cannabis reform and all that stuff. My purpose of my podcast is to bring a perspective of a cannabis consumer to the law enforcement side, because I did it for 11 years, and to bring the law enforcement side to the cannabis consumers and to talk about it. And I recently was just on a podcast, a law enforcement specific podcast, and actually felt as though I was able to educate the host of the show about the benefits of it, and not in a free the weed, everybody let's get high type thing, but in the actual medicinal benefits of cannabis and how it can be used safely or irresponsibly. And then again, for the people who want to just recreate at home and, smoke as opposed to drink, and how to keep that, in perspective.
AJ, okay, so you were a cop.
Yes.
And from what years were you a police officer?
2006 to 2017.
And you're what we call you were a highway patrol officer.
That is correct.
Patrol the highways, stopped people, arrested them for drug crimes,
Yes.
and everything in between, correct?
Correct.
All right. So at some point, you left law enforcement.
Yes.
I don't think you mind, you made it sound like it was worse than really what it was.
I appreciate
You had a small domestic situation with your wife.
Yes.
Which you ended up getting charged with domestic violence.
That is correct.
And then we met because I represented you.
That is 100% correct.
You referred to me by another D.P.S. officer, former D.P.S. officer. We got to be friends during the representation. Your case was eventually dismissed, and you don't have a record.
And my wife and I are still together.
Correct. So, I want our viewers to understand that it wasn't some major crime that you
Right.
committed. So this is all it was.
And I also believe in being, if I'm going to have any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for here? I need to be open and honest about my past, and if I'm going to have any type of credibility. So yeah, I have no problem.
So you now understand the system from two different perspectives.
Yes.
One as a police officer, and one as actually being a defendant.
Yes.
All right. Were you surprised by how you were treated by the system?
No, because I had a really good lawyer. So I paid him good money. So the system was, it was confusing. It was very nerve-wracking. The biggest part of the confusion and nerve-wracking part was actually what occurred from my department. That's something that we can discuss now or later, whatever the case may be. But the things that attributed to me becoming the person I was at that point in time were 100% attributed to my being a police officer. And I'm not going to say the department specifically, just being a police officer and dealing with the trauma, the emotional trauma, the mental trauma, and all that. So unfortunately, I was too busy, pardon my language, being a badass cop. I was not taking care of my mental health. I was not taking care of my physical health. I was not taking care of my family. I was just too focused on being, the cool cop that got to fly around the state. So when my issue occurred, I will say that I was treated very fairly by the law enforcement agency that took custody of me. And I didn't have any problems with that. But then going through the process of just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting to hear what's going to happen and all that stuff was very, very stressful.
Your department was not very supportive as far as mental health, the mental health aspect of your case.
At that time, I don't believe there was any law enforcement agency that was good at mental health. I received when the date of my occurrence was roughly March of 2017. I did not speak to a single person in my department until it was basically time to talk about what punishment I was going to get. Nobody checked in on me. Nobody talked to me. There was no mental health counselors. There was no, how did we get to this point? Why is this officer, and I apologize for tooting my own horn here, I had 0 citizens complaints. I had life-saving awards. I was highly decorated. I was highly respected. I tell people, call the people that I used to work with and talk to them about me. I have no problem with that. And there was nothing. I was literally abandoned by my department and by my previous department. But with that being said, it is my understanding now that there is something called, I believe, the Tiger Act. And I think it's the Tiger Act. There was a police officer, unfortunately, who had some mental health issues and had a previous officer who had committed suicide, and his ex-wife fought for this legislation. So now police officers do have recourse to utilize mental health aspects of it. But on that note, it's still going to take a lot for a police officer to ask for mental health.
So now you've become an advocate for the intelligent use of marijuana.
Yes.
When you were a police officer, what were your thoughts about drug use in marijuana?
So I had very tiny bit of experimentation when I was a teenager, just experimented with friends and stuff like that. Again, I had an older brother who was a terrible influence on me as a kid. But I did not care necessarily about the personal use part of people that had, small amounts of cannabis on them. I didn't necessarily care about that. There are times I absolutely had to enforce the law. I had to arrest those people, but I was way more concerned about the criminal activity of the drug cartels. So I was one of those police officers that would sit out there and interdict huge, big loads, whether it's a hidden load or what's called a suicide load here in Arizona, where they just throw the stuff in the back of the car and try to make it to Phoenix. I was more concerned about the criminal activity of the cartels. So I was going after the big boys. who were moving it back and forth. I did not do long-term drug investigations. I was on the streets looking for it on the streets in large quantities in vehicles that are being smuggled into Arizona.
Were you for legalization when you were a cop?
I've always been for legalization. I've always thought it was ridiculous that a plant was illegal. So and from dealing with personal experiences of having pulled over and arrested at people on every slew of drugs, the worst one on the planet is alcohol. And then the one that was totally easy to deal with people was when they were high on cannabis. So
let me ask you, I get a lot of clients that ask, what should they do if they're stopped by law enforcement? What do you think a motorist should do, and what do you think a motorist should not do based on your experience?
So the number one thing is that from my personal experience having pulled people over, I would look at the car itself, and it's not the driver of the car. I would look at the car itself, and I try to tell people, first of all, have your license, have your insurance, make sure your car's registered and all that good stuff. Make sure you don't have anything broken, so that you're not drawing attention to yourself. But don't do things to draw attention to yourself. Don't have large marijuana stickers on your car. Don't do those things. But when the time comes and you are pulled over, and we all get pulled over. I mean, again, I was an officer and I still don't like getting pulled over. It's very annoying. Is be respectful, and there's also a way to be respectful and not be an asshole, but to tell the officer, listen, and I personally, have your license, registration, and insurance ready to go. Yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, that type of thing. Understand that they are just doing a job, but have your information necessary. And I always tell people, I don't tell people to not necessarily don't talk to cops, but say the least amount of information necessary. You don't need to, I would tell people, don't consent to search. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not giving law or legal advice, but I very much believe in our individual rights. I very much believe that even as a police officer, if somebody didn't want me to search the car and I didn't have anything past that, I would have to respect that. But don't say the least amount possible. Don't agree to consent to searches, and focus on the matter at hand, which was the traffic violation. So don't give the officer more than they need.
AJ, would you agree that in a lot of stop situations, the officer may have a hunch that this person may have drugs, maybe trafficking in drugs, but the officer has nothing? And so the officer then starts to, I've had instances where the officer asks the subject to step out of the car. They'll come up with an excuse, well, you have a radar device on your car, you have a GPS, and it's blocking your view.
Right.
In Arizona, that can be a reason to stop somebody. Or you have a broken taillight,
right,
or you didn't signal when you changed lanes. They come up with a minor reason, that's all they have.
Yes.
But they have a hunch, they ask the motorist to step out, and they engage the motorist in a conversation. And my client ends up in handcuffs.
Right.
What is going on there? What is the officer trying to do?
The officer is trying to elicit information that the person would not. It's one, I don't have a problem with officers getting people out of the car. That's actually how I conducted every single traffic stop, unless there was other reasons. But I would say, hey, do me a favor, grab your license, registration, insurance, come on out and step to the back of the car. And that was actually more for their safety and my safety as well, so that, let's say if we're stopped on the highway and we're, the two cars are back to back to each other, front to nose, if the car got hit and we were off to the side, we weren't going to get injured. So getting people out of the car I don't have a problem with. But it's when officers are talking and they're asking questions, it's the sort of thing where I used to say people could talk themselves into handcuffs all day long. And what the officer is doing, a well-trained officer, particularly in interdiction, looking for drug smuggling, human smuggling, credit card theft, ID theft, stuff like that. They're trying to get a gauge on the person's level of stress. And they're trying to get a gauge on what the person is, their physical attributes, their physiological things. I can tell you this right now, that when I did go through some certain training, and I'm not going to give away any law or officer safety tips or anything like that, they had said that when you have a drug load and that person is nervous about it, that you will literally see their carotid artery pulsating. And I called total BS on that. I said, there's no possible way. Like that, you're ridiculous. That's not going to happen. Until I actually had one. And had I had that person in the car, I never would have seen that. And I had a person where I could physically see their carotid artery jumping out at me, screaming at me. But it was showing their level of nervousness above and beyond being just pulled over by the police officer. They're trying to gauge, do the stories match? They're trying to gauge, does this person maybe smuggling something that they shouldn't have? And another thing too, in this day and age, human smuggling is ginormous. So it's talking to the driver, getting their side of the story, and then going to the vehicle and talking to the people in the car and getting their story. Sometimes you can. I'm a big believer in trying to prevent crime as opposed to trying to harass people. So I would talk to the children in the car and try to get their information to see, hey, is this person really your uncle, really your dad, really whatever the case is. So it's just trying to get a gauge on the whole situation, the totality of the circumstances, and maybe there's something else that's going to give that officer reasonable suspicion to dive into the car, to search the car with more than just consent.
So the officer is looking for a reason to search that car.
Absolutely.
And by talking to this person at the side of the road, this person may make some statements that allow the officer to believe that he has sufficient evidence or probable cause that this person may have some drugs.
Agreed. Or credit card fraud, or smuggling guns, or whatever the case, but a criminal activity of some kind, yes.
Right. And at some point, the officer may ask the motorist to sign a consent form or to agree to a search.
They will ask for that, yes.
All right. And should the motorist agree to have their car searched?
My personal opinion on that aspect is no. Do not. And again, going back down to the foundation of our country and our Bill of Rights, I would not consent to in search of any way, shape, or whether you have something or not. I still believe in exerting our own personal rights. So no, I would not agree, nor would I tell anybody to agree to a consent to search or filling out or consenting by signing the form or whatever the case is.
D.P.S. is really famous for this. I've had several cases where the officer stops the motorist, engages in conversation, and then asks the motorist for consent to search the vehicle. The motorist says yes. And then the officer on the side of the road basically is dismantling the car, is going into the dash, is taking the radio out, is opening up the trunk, is opening up the hood, is looking in the gas tank. In fact, you were retained by me on a case where they had a motorist out there side of the road for an hour.
Yes.
And took the car apart and eventually found drugs in the gas tank.
Yes.
And that officer had admitted to us, a D.P.S. officer, that in at least 100 occasions, going on a hunch, he stopped a motorist, got that motorist to consent, tore the car apart, literally tore the car apart, and found zero, nothing, and not even apologized to the motorist, but left them, with a pile of parts on the side of the road, and he called it a day.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I think that looking back at, I think there's two parts to it. The first part is that it's that officer honing their skill. It's that officer learning to look for the signs and symptoms, because I'll be honest, it took me 2 years before I got my very first big drug load inside of a vehicle. But it's the officer honing their skills. And now, don't quote me on department policy anymore. I've been out of the game too long with that particular department. But it used to be you could only ask for consent to search if you maybe had reasonable suspicion, not up to the level of probable cause yet, but if you maybe had some inconsistencies in the story and you had to validate your reason why you were asking for consent to search. But previous to that, when I very first started, we could ask anybody to search anything, and that consent to search went as far as that person standing on the side of the road would allow us to go. So if at any point in time they retracted their consent and you still only had consent, then that officer's supposed to stop.
But most motorists
don't know this.
Feel too intimidated to ever ask an officer, please stop searching.
I agree with that. I agree with that statement. A lot of people are intimidated by law enforcement, obviously for particular reasons. I mean, they're the only job in the country that can strip away your rights and lock you up. So I understand that intimidation and that trepidation to tell the officer to stop. But yeah, it's the officer honing their skills and just trying to get into people's cars. And the flip side of that is too, that the other part that's hard for me to get a break away from is that I did this, and there are drugs, you know, fentanyl, carfentanil, heroin, meth, all that stuff running up and down the highways, and it needs to be found. So, but that's where good training, good experience, good officers come from, but they have to get that experience somehow. And sometimes it is at the behest of other motorists that don't know they can not consent to a search.
So you would agree that once the motorist is given you a registration license, proof of insurance, that they don't have to answer any questions.
That is correct.
And they could certainly tell the officer, well, officer, thank you for inquiring, but I'm not going to answer any more questions. And that would be a good manner to handle that stop, so that you don't talk yourself into handcuffs.
I agree 100% with that. I see, and again, me personally, I never had a problem if people were respectful and nice and said, officer, I don't want to talk about that. Okay, but yes, I'm a firm believer in, you know, officer, here's my license, registration, insurance, you know, thank you for what you do. Whatever enforcement action you're going to take, go ahead and take it, but I just choose not to speak to you.
And that stops your investigation right there.
Should. If
And
that
then-
officer has nothing else, it should.
And then when the officer says, do you mind if I search your car? The answer should be no.
No, thank you, sir. Ma'am, sir, whatever the case is.
All right. And if the officer searches anyway, should the motorist try to physically stop the cop?
No, that would be a very bad idea, but you can. Everybody carries this, and I would 100% recommend you pull out your cell phone and start filming immediately. So there's nothing preventing you from your First Amendment rights to, you know, record the officers. I do know that there's some laws going through in Arizona regarding distance of recording police officers, but no, you don't physically try to stop the police officer. That will end very, very badly, no matter what the justification, if there was justification.
Assert your rights and then let your lawyer later on argue the validity of whatever they found.
Yes. And again, pull out that cell phone and start recording immediately. I'm also a huge fan of dash cams in cars, private citizens having dash cams in cars.
AJ, why do you think, you know, as a former D.P.S. officer, why do you think police are so afraid of citizens filming them?
You know, I can't answer that question because I never once had an issue with that. I never once had a problem with that. There was a time, if everybody remembers here in Arizona, back in 2009, 10, 11, somewhere in that time period, there was a huge issue with the town of Guadalupe and Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. And I used to make traffic stops right there on I-10 along Baseline, right next to the town of Guadalupe. And there was a lot of protesters that were out there filming during this time period. And I made a traffic stop. A protester came right up to me with a camera. And I said, hey man, just so you know, I'm D.P.S, I'm not MCSO. I said, I know you guys are out here for that. He goes, oh, okay. He goes, do you mind if I film? I said, no, have them all film. That's never bothered me. And I think that that's seen as contempt of cop when that officer gets frustrated by it and doesn't want to be filmed. But I don't understand not wanting to be filmed. Film me. Make sure that I'm doing my job ethically and morally, and make sure that I'm, you know, playing by the rules of the Constitution. I never had a problem with that, and I do have an issue with officers that have a problem with it.
It seems the ones that don't want to be filmed, it's because they know that they're going to be captured on camera violating somebody's rights.
I think that's a good assumption. That I think that maybe the officer doesn't have enough yet to reach the level of probable cause, but I think that's a safe assumption.
AJ, how did you go from blue to green? Tell us about your advocacy on behalf of intelligent laws with respect to cannabis.
So I was a volunteer for a group that was just setting up and taking down stuff for cannabis events. I just wanted to kind of learn more and kind of grow. I was kind of bored and didn't have much going on, so I got involved with the group. Some of the leaders of that group found out my background, and from that they found out my background, and then they asked me, they said, would you be willing to put together some kind of presentation when we have these events to teach, this is before recreational was legal, so it was only medical patients. Could you put together a short little presentation to teach medical patients how to interact with law enforcement? I said, I'd love to. Excuse me. I gave my first presentation, and the first time was in front of about 400 people. And so then from there, I had another presentation, and then myself and another attorney here in the state of here in Arizona we did a couple of classes together from both sides. She can give the law and legal side, Sonia Martinez, and then I gave the practical side in practice. And I realized that I kind of had something to say. and people were listening to me and they were interested in what I had to say. So that just spawned off from there. I think I'm going to start a podcast, and I think I'm going to start teaching people and talking about these things and talking about it as a former police officer has a totally different perspective on it. So that led to my segue into being a podcaster now. So that's how I got started on that avenue.
So what do you think about the legalization of all drugs? What do you think about that?
My mind has definitely changed in that aspect, having left law enforcement. We have laws on the books for neglect, for assault, for abuse. We have those laws, and I don't necessarily believe that it's the drugs that make people do those things. But I do believe that it's sometimes a factor that does drive the bad behavior, whether it's theft, breaking into people's houses or cars, looking for money to buy the drugs. But I also I've become much more of a libertarian in my old age, and I believe that we're personally responsible for our personal decisions. And if somebody wants to use whatever drug in the privacy of their home, I don't have a problem with that. If they leave their home and are committing other crimes, I think we have those laws on the books. So it's complicated as far as that goes. But as far as like the studies go, we're showing psilocybin and ayahuasca and all the psychotropic or psychedelic drugs. They're showing promises in the front from a medicinal standpoint. So I think on that standpoint, we definitely need to take a look at them as more of medicine as opposed to just, seeing pretty colors and unicorns and all that stuff. So I think that it's something that needs to be studied. I don't agree with public consumption. I don't want to see heroin addicts shooting up. I don't want to see anything like that. I don't even want to see people smoking weed out on the street. I think in the privacy somewhere, or, a little smoking designated section. But my thought process has definitely changed on the legality of drugs, and I think we need to look at it as more allowing people to make personal decisions and personal responsibility.
But you didn't necessarily feel that way when you were a cop.
I did not feel that way when I was a cop. That has definitely changed, and I saw all drugs as bad. I even saw cannabis as not good. I didn't see it as bad, but I saw it as not having the medicinal properties until I started really understanding it. So yeah, that part has definitely changed.
All right. And what's on the forefront with AZ Normal?
So we're a patient and consumer advocacy group. So what we do is we talk to lawmakers, we talk to legislators, we try to get good cannabis laws passed. And for those who do consume cannabis here in Arizona, every single year we fight legislation that wants to tamp down on the amount of THC that's allowed, on the products that are allowed. No, I don't think cannabis-based products should look like children's gummies and stuff like that. I think it needs to be treated more as medicine, but every single year there's more and more laws that are trying to get put on the books that would literally kill the medical marijuana program and will kill the recreational program, even though the recreational was passed by over 60% of Arizonans in the last election cycle. So we're advocates. We're trying to get research, we're trying to get funding for research, and we're basically fighting the government to allow research to happen and to allow for responsible adults to medicate and to consume responsibly. So it's just a constant battle every single year.
AJ, if somebody wants to listen to you on your podcast, how do they find you?
I'm on Spotify. I've got the video on Spotify too, so you can see this face that's made for radio. I'm on Spotify, I'm on Apple, I'm on iTunes, I'm on all that stuff. My Instagram is blue, the color blue, BLUE, 2green.official podcast. My Facebook is blue to green podcast. And if you want to reach out to me, my email is bluetogreenpodcast@gmail.com. So instant messages, all that good stuff, DMs, and however you want to contact me. So
AJ, it's been very informative. Thank you for agreeing to come on here and chat with me. And for all those of you viewers out there, reach out to AJ. He's a wealth of knowledge and a real good guy.
So, and thank you for being my friend for so many years now. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you again.
Peace.